first to Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio now on whether we're doing enough to stop a possible attack here. Senator, very good to have you.
Thank you, Neil.
First, what do you make of that and these 40-some-odd Americans, we're told, Senator, have gotten back into this country and no one knows what they're going to be doing?
Well, that's a real threat. It's one of the reasons that makes them so dangerous. It's not just the Americans. It's the hundreds, perhaps 1,000 or so of those who have joined ISIL abroad who have passports from visa waiver countries that allow them easy access to the United States. It also includes the prospect of lone wolf attacks, basically individuals that never traveled to Syria, never joined ISIL, but somehow have come to sympathize with them for one reason or another, who are here in the U.S. now and can carry out attacks as well. Look, it's a dangerous situation, and it's one that we need to confront. And by the way, it's not just ISIL. There are multiple other groups out there that also are pursuing the same line. What makes ISIL so dangerous is how quickly they were able to expand the territory they control, the large amounts of money they've gotten their hands on, and the number of foreign fighters that have joined them. But there are multiple groups out there that are actively plotting on an ongoing basis to conduct attacks against Americans, both here in the homeland and around the world.
It would seem to be like closing the barn door if the animals have left to cut off their passports now, at least in the case of these guys. What do we do?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think we have to be more vigilant in trying to identify as many of them as possible. Second, we continue to try to identify anyone who's trying to carry out an attack in the U.S. I think what makes this more difficult is that these groups are not as given to big, spectacular attacks. I mean, when you're going to do something like, God forbid, 9/11, I mean, that requires a level of coordination that takes a significant period of time. If, however, your plan is to carry out some sort of a domestic attack as a lone wolf that involves killing a couple dozen people, something like what happened at the Boston Marathon, those are a lot more difficult to spot. There's a lot less chatter, a lot less activity, a lot less planning, and a lot less coordination. This is just going to be an ongoing threat for the foreseeable future because radical Islam isn't just an organization. It's an ideology that has spread to every corner of the world now.
You know, Senator, I know you can't convey much of the intelligence, as you said, on the Foreign Relations Committee, but we are getting wind now that British hostage Alan Henning, his wife has reported that an audio file of him pleading for his life has been released as fears build that he could be the next victim of these ongoing ISIS attacks on innocent foreigners. As this keeps escalating in the light of our attacks, does it mean we do need boots on the ground? Does it mean that ISIS will continue acting as it has unless we, as I think your colleague John McCain has said, put at least some boots on the ground? Do you agree with that?
Well, first we have to understand what the goal is. The goal is to defeat ISIL and radical Islam anywhere in the world that it poses a threat to the United States. That's what we have to focus on, not just the tactics. The second question is, can we defeat them simply through airstrikes? The answer is no. We can degrade them. We can certainly hurt them dramatically and set them back, but you cannot ultimately defeat them. They are now an army. They're an insurgency. They're not just a terrorist group. They have to be defeated by someone on the ground. Now, in a perfect world, that would be local forces. That would be the Iraqi army. That would be Syrian rebels. That would be Kurds. But very few people think that that's going to come together in time. There is the very real possibility that it will require some level of American ground troops, special operation operators, things of this nature, to carry out that sort of mission in the long term. Because the answer can't be that if the Iraqis and the Syrian rebels can't defeat them, ISIS gets to stay. That can't be the alternative.
Senator, much has been said that whatever attack we're taking to ISIS right now will spill over into the next president and maybe the next president after that. Do you buy that argument that this is sort of like a generational battle to take on terror? ISIS is just the latest example.
I hope that it isn't the case, but we have to be prepared for the reality that it could be. I mean, these groups certainly think in those terms. They certainly think in terms of a long-term struggle, not simply a 2 or 3 year endeavor. And as we've seen just in the last decade or so since 9/11, a decade and a half since 9/11, it used to be one core group called Al-Qaeda that was in Afghanistan, then went to the tribal areas of Pakistan. Now Al-Qaeda has multiple affiliates, including one now in the Indian Peninsula. And in addition to that, you have spin-off groups like ISIS or ISIL. You have al-Nusra. You have the Khorasan group now in Syria. You have other radical groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and others. You have groups operating out of Libya. You have groups operating in northern Africa. So this is a real threat, and it will continue to pose one as these groups continue to spin off and take on new iterations throughout the world. So we need to be prepared for the fact that for the rest of our lifetimes, you and I and others watching this program, radical Islam will pose a threat to the West and to peace and security.
If you ever became president, if you ever had the interest, Senator, would you advocate a permanent U.S. troop presence in the region? Permanent.
Absolutely. Let me give you two examples of why. Number one, the Al-Qaeda mission, the mission to target bin Laden would have been impossible without a U.S. troop mission in Afghanistan. Second, you've seen what's happened in Iraq, and people think that having troops on the ground in Iraq would have prevented ISIL's advances. To some extent, that's true, but there's another aspect to it. When the U.S. pulled out of Iraq, it allowed Maliki, then the prime minister, to go whole hog on his persecution of Sunnis, which then created fertile ground for the sort of insurgency we now see. So you have Sunnis and Sunni areas of Iraq that don't necessarily sympathize with ISIL's ideology, but they hate the Shia government so much that they were willing to welcome ISIL fighters as liberators at the time. Now I think they're starting to bristle under some of the more radical Sharia law that they're imposing. But at the time, ISIL took advantage not just of the weakness of the Iraqi army, but the lack of support that Baghdad had in many of the Sunni areas. So again, if the U.S. had a presence, we would have had more leverage over how Maliki conducted his affairs. You would have had a more stable region, but also a place where you can conduct operations against other threats in the region. So I'm not saying 100,000 troops, but certainly some level that allows us to project power quickly and confront challenges and threats.
All right, now that's a somewhat different stance, Senator, than your colleague Rand Paul, who had, sort of taken an opposite view with Hillary Clinton's argument that maybe had we taken a toughened approach and supported those trying to overthrow Syria's Assad, that might have been bad news then. A number of Republicans were pushing for that at the time, but that would have only emboldened what is, he says, ISIS today. Do you agree with that?
No, because here's what happened. What happened is that I'm not saying to you that, well, first of all, we didn't start the uprising in Syria. It was started by Syrians. And I believed at the time we should try to find somebody we can work with on the ground in Syria and make sure they're the strongest group there. Because if we didn't, it would leave a space. And that space would be filled by foreign fighters. Because foreign fighters and jihadists need operating space. They are constantly looking for a vacuum where they can go. Well, that's what happened. These groups were weakened. These foreign fighters came in, they were able to acquire weapons, they were able to acquire funding from donors throughout the Gulf kingdoms, and suddenly the most powerful groups in Syria were not the people we thought we might be able to work with, but were rather these foreign fighters from ISIL and from Nusra and from Khorasan and others. And now we've got this threat on our hands. There's no guarantee that would have worked, but it was guaranteed that our failure to try to identify someone we could have worked with early on created the space that allowed ISIL to come in. And that's the result of it now. And I think the president made a major mistake.
Okay, Rand Paul has been criticized, to John McCain's point, being all over the map on this, being hands-off as a libertarian in his earlier days, now maybe closer to a run for president, less so. Do you agree with that?
With what, I'm sorry?
With Rand Paul and his evolving positions on foreign policy.
Well, again, I'll leave it up to him to tell you what his positions are today. Like I said, if someone has changed their mind on something of national security, we welcome that because the threat is now real. But I think what's important to understand for future reference here is that a mistake was made early on here, that our decision not to engage at some level early on is what actually left in place the conditions that made the rise of ISIL possible. And that was a big mistake. In the absence of American leadership, these other countries in the region decided to arm anyone who was against Assad, and unfortunately that included some of these very radical groups.
Sir, if I can go back to your fine state of Florida, Charlie Crist gaining some steam right now with some help from Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton saying, Charlie Crist didn't leave the Republican Party left him. What do you think of that? Because this is the same Bill Clinton of whom Charlie Crist had once said should resign offices after the Monica Lewinsky affair for the dignity of the office. What do you think of this?
Well, first of all, the Republican Party didn't leave Charlie Crist. Charlie Crist abandoned the Republican Party when he was running against me, and the polls showed he was going to lose. He was a Republican up until late April, at least a Republican in name, as of late April of 2010. And the only reason why he shifted parties was because he couldn't win a primary. In fact, on a debate with Chris Wallace on this very network, he flat out said he wouldn't do that, and then 2 weeks later he did. So that's why he left. He's a political opportunist of the first degree.
Well, he's polling well. Are you surprised he's polling as well as he is?
No, I think Rick Scott has recaptured the momentum. Consistently, the polls are showing him opening up a lead. And the reason why is because I suspect even Democrats in Florida are a bit disgusted with Charlie Crist and what he represents or doesn't represent. I don't think they believe his conversion or lack thereof is a legitimate one, and they think it's all about positioning himself to win an office. That's all he's ever wanted to be, is someone who holds political office. He'll be whatever he needs to be to win. That's not the kind of leadership Florida needs. It never was.
Real quickly, sir, I mean, there's been talk back and forth as to whether Mitt Romney will try to go for a three-peat. His own wife has been saying that, taking that as word, that he's not interested, but seems to hint that if Jeb Bush were not to run, he just might. Now, I don't want to put words in her mouth. Does that mean anything to you, that if Jeb Bush were to run, you would not, or not even consider it?
Well, again, I mean, anyone who's considering running for something like the presidency needs to make that decision based on themselves, not on anybody else. I think we would all expect, I expect fully, that the Republican nomination will be hotly contested among a number of highly qualified individuals.
But would you run if Jeb Bush were running?
Yeah, if I were to decide to run, it would be irrespective of anyone else who's running. I certainly wouldn't make my decision based on who else was running. I haven't made that decision. I suspect that others haven't as well, but haven't either. But I think when you make a decision to run for an office of that magnitude, you don't do it based on who else may or may not be running.
Senator Marco Rubio, very good having you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.